Hi everyone, Suzanne here. I hope you're all well and welcome to Sew Custom. Today's video, as you'll have already seen from the thumbnail, is how I sewed up this little number. So if you're interested in seeing that, then let's get started.
Starting with the fabric, this is a viscose jersey. It has stretch in both directions, perfect for a project like this, and on to the cutting out. This is my front. I have a couple of notches on one side to mark where my tie will go, 2 layers of fabric underneath my pattern piece. So that's that done. And the first thing to do to this piece is to stabilize the neckline. I'm using some stretch tape here, lining it up with the neckline and pressing into place. Happy with that? So now just to finish the edges on the side seams. So just running those through the overlocker, just to tidy them up. I've given those seams a nice press, and this is how they look. So that's all the prep work required for now for this piece. So I'm going to set it aside to work on the back. I have those same notches for my ties. My fabric underneath is on the fold. And off camera, I went ahead and ran those side seams through the overlocker, just like I did on the front. And I've added that same stabilizing tape to the neckline. So now that that's done, I'm ready to join the front and back together at the shoulder seams. My fabric is right sides together and ready to stitch. So straight to the overlocker this time, sewing at my 1 centimeter seam allowance. That just needs a press, which you can see I've went ahead and done here. And now that that's done, I'm ready to close up the side seams. So laying my front over my back, my fabric is right sides together, lining up my edges, lining up my notches, and pinning into place. And I'm going to stitch on one side from the underarm down to that notch you see me snip earlier. I'm going to back stitch there, leave a little gap, back stitch again, and sew right down to the hem. And on the other side, I'm just going to sew from the underarm to the hem, no stopping. So to the sewing machine this time, starting as I said at the underarm point with a back stitch, coming down to that first notch, taking a few back stitches here, moving my fabric along to the second notch, another few back stitches, and straight down to the hem. Sewing at my 1 centimeter seam allowance and finishing with a back stitch. I've pressed that seam open off camera, and you can see here I've got that little gap on one side for my tie. So now that that's done, I'm ready to take care of both the hem on the dress and the hem on the sleeves. I've ran the edges of both through the overlocker, and here pressing in underneath by my allowance. I'll finish that pressing and pin those hems up off camera, which you can see here. And ready to stitch. Starting with the sleeve hem at the underarm point, sewing directly through those overlock stitches and finishing with the back stitch. I'll give that a press off camera, which you'll see in a second, and onto the hem of the dress. Exactly the same thing here again, starting with a back stitch, sewing straight through those overlock stitches and finishing with a back stitch. And that's how my sleeve hems look after a press. And the hem of the dress. Happy with those. So now that that's done, I'm ready for my ties. So I have 2 ties to cut out. This one is my longest one. So my fabric underneath is on the fold on both the long side and the short side. That's that done. And for my second tie, my fabric is on the fold, just this time on the long side. So I have a little bit of prep work to do to both before I can add them to the dress. So just lining up the long edges, my fabric is right sides together, and I want to give myself a little point at the bottom of each of my ties. So stitching here from the folded edge at a diagonal to the cut edge, little pivot, and then stitching the whole way down at my 1 centimeter seam allowance. Back stitching to start and to finish, and of course I've done exactly the same to my second tie. So I just need to trim back my corners, turn the whole thing right side out and give them a press. So just trimming here quite close to my stitch line. And after they've been pulled through and pressed, this is how they look. Happy with those. Now to add them to the dress. So just lining up the cut ends with the bottom of the neckline on both sides. And pinning into place. And stitching here about 1 millimeter or so inside my seam allowance, starting and finishing with a back stitch. And after they've been pressed, this is how they look. So now that that's done, I'm ready to finish my neckline. And for this dress, I've decided on a bias finish. So I've cut myself a strip of the outer fabric, and I'm just lining up one end with the hem, tucking that bottom edge in underneath. My fabric is right sides together and popping in a pin. And I'm going to stitch from that hem the whole way up the skirt, right up the neckline, around the back and down the other side. Starting with the back stitch, sewing at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, trying to make sure that my edges are lined up the whole way around. Little pivot there, up the neckline, around the back neck, same little pivot at the bottom of the neckline on the other side. And then when I get to the hem on the other side, tucking that end of the bias in underneath and stitching right over the top. Finishing with a back stitch. So now to make sure that this bias sits nicely tucked away in underneath, I want to understitch. And in preparation for that, I need to trim down that seam allowance. So I'm taking away here probably about 2/3. I'll finish that off camera. And before taking back to the machine to stitch into place, I'm just going to press that bias away from the dress, but make sure that that trim seam allowance in underneath is butted up against it. So I finished that off camera and stitching here through the bias, through that trim seam allowance in underneath, starting with a back stitch. I'm about 1 millimetre or 2 away from the dress, taking this nice and gently the whole way around, trying to be as neat as possible. And finishing with a back stitch. So now to complete the bias, I just need to take care of that raw edge. So folding it in underneath, pressing into place, and then folding again and pressing. And again, I'll finish that off camera. And here, stitching right along that inner crease edge, starting with a back stitch, and I'm taking my time here the whole way around, trying to hug that crease edge. And finishing with a back stitch. I'll give that one final press off camera, and this is how it looks. Super happy with this. And with that, this little dress is complete. So all I need to do now is tie my ties, and this is how it looks on. I am over the moon with how this has turned out, and you've just seen it sews up so quickly. I love the neckline. I like that it's not too low. Those sleeves are my favourite type of sleeve. I love the ties at the side. I love the length of the skirt, the shape of the skirt, how comfortable it is. Can you tell? I really love this dress.
So I really hope you guys enjoyed the video. I hope you found it useful. If you did, give it a thumbs up. If you've not yet subscribed, please do, and I shall see you on Friday. Until then, I hope you have a fantastic week. Bye, folks!